What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. On today's video, we have the second of two games we recorded with our friend Javonn last week. First, we have Robert spice things up for the channel by playing Fogg's Daghatar the Adamant Megamorph +1/+1 counter deck. This deck wants to use the deck's morph creatures to take advantage of weird colorless creature and +1/+1 counter synergies that are built into the deck. Then we have Javonn showing up in his second video on the channel, playing another blinged out deck, and this time it's a Sliver Overlord deck. It's a powerful 5-color Sliver deck you love to hate. What more can I say? Next we have Fogg playing his Hallar the Firefletcher +1/+1 counter kicker Voltron deck. This deck is an old Fog classic that looks to take advantage of Hallar's ability to kill all of his opponents at one time with a couple well-timed kicker spells. Last but never least, we have Justin doing what he does best and playing yet another Dimir deck, and this time it's his sometimes Oona, sometimes Miracle Vosk mill deck. This deck looks to mill out his opponents while also annoying everybody at the table in order to solidify himself as public enemy number 1. Now let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck comes out on top. Javonn starts out the game by playing a Scalding Tarn, taking 1 to crack it, and declaring he's going to get an Underground Sea, and then he's going to tap it to cast a Training Grounds before passing his turn. Fogg starts off his turn by playing a Carplusian Forest and tapping it to cast the Ozolith, and then he passes. Justin draws for turn, plays a Choked Estuary, revealing a Swamp, then taps 1 to cast a Soul Ring and passes his turn to Robert, who draws, plays a Forest, and then passes his turn to Javonn. Turn 2 starts off with Javonn drawing and dropping in a Bayou, and then tapping 2 and casting Unnatural Selection before passing. Fogg untaps for turn, draws, plays a Temple of Abandon, scrying 1, then taps a Carplusian Forest, taking 1 damage to create a green and casts a Spore Frog before passing to Justin. Justin draws for turn, untaps, plays an Island, then taps 2 and a Soul Ring to cast Memory Erosion, and then passes his turn to Robert, who draws and plays a Plains before passing. Javonn starts off turn 3 by untapping and drawing a card for turn, then he plays a Wooded Foothills, and he takes the 1 damage to sack it and go get a Tega before passing his turn. Fogg untaps for turn, draws, plays a Forest, then he taps 2 and he casts an Atarka's Command, choosing to deal 3 damage to each opponent and dropping it in a mountain. He then passes. Justin untaps for turn, draws, plays a Swamp, then he taps 3 and he casts a Psychic Corrosion, and he passes his turn to Robert. Robert draws for turn, plays another Forest, taps 3, casts a Rites of Flourishing, and then mills 2 off the Memory Erosion trigger. He then passes Javonn, who before the end of his turn, plays a Mystical Tutor, going to look for an instant of sorcery to put on top of his library. After tutoring for a card, Javonn starts off his turn by drawing, playing a Breeding Pool, which he decides to have come into play tapped. Then he remembers he needs to draw a second card off of Rites of Flourishing and play an additional land, so he draws another card, plays a Mountain, taps 2 lands, and he casts a Demonic Tutor, milling 2 cards, and then searching his library for a card. He then passes the Fogg, who untaps, draws his 2 cards, then plays a Forest, tapping 3, casting his commander Hallar the Firefletcher, milling 2, then tapping 2 more, taking damage off the Carplusian Forest, and playing Evolutionary Escalation and milling another 2. He then passes to Justin, who untaps for turn, draws his first card, targeting Robert with the mill from the Psychic Corrosion. Robert mills 2 cards. Then Justin draws another one, targeting Robert again, having Robert mill 2 more cards. He then plays a Swamp, and then taps out all his lands to cast his commander Oona, Queen of the Fae, before passing to Robert. Robert draws 2 cards for turn. Then he plays another Plains. And he taps 3, casts a Chromatic Lantern, mills 2, and then taps another 3, and plays his first Morph creature, passing his turn to Javonn. Javonn starts off his turn by drawing 2 cards, and then tapping 3 and casting a Harmonic Sliver, milling 2, and blowing up the Memory Erosion. He then taps 2 more, casting Crystalline Sliver, destroying the Psychic Corrosion, and then passes his turn. Fog on taps for turn, puts 3 counters on the Morph and 3 counters on Hallar from the Evolutionary Escalation trigger, and then draws 2. He then taps 3, casting a Kicked Cinderclasm, putting another counter on Hallar, dealing 4 damage to each of his opponents, and then 2 damage to each creature. He then taps 2 to cast a Ram through target Oona, dealing 5 damage to her with 2 trample over damage, and then swings Hallar Javonn for 7 commander damage and passes. Justin untaps for turn. Draws his 2 cards. Then he taps 4. And casts a Court of Ambition, becoming the Monarch. He then taps 2. Casts some Lightning Greaves. And then goes to his instep, drawing for the Monarch. Robert starts out his turn by untapping, drawing his 2 cards. Tapping 1. And playing Retribution of the Ancients. He then decides to tap 3 more and cast a second Morph creature before passing his turn to Javonn. Javonn starts off his turn by untapping his lands and then drawing 2 cards. And then playing an untapped Blood Crypt, taking 2 damage, and then tapping 1 to cast an Aether Vial before passing his turn. Fog untaps for turn, draws his 2 cards, then plays a Karn's Bastion for turn before remembers Escalation triggers, putting 3 counters on Hallar, 3 counters on the new Morph, taps 1 to cast a Soul Ring, then taps 4 to cast a Kicked Canopy Surge, dealing 4 damage to each creature and each player, putting another counter on Hallar, and then dealing 8 damage before swinging 11 commander damage to Justin and passing. Justin untaps for turn, draws his 2 cards, plays a tapped Crypt of Agadeem, then taps 5 to cast Nemesis of Reason before equipping it with his Lightning Greaves. He then passes his turn to Robert. Robert untaps for turn, draws 2 cards, then tells everybody he's playing an untapped Bayou, aka Undergrowth Stadium, then drops in another Swamp for turn. He then taps 4, and casts a new card, Felice, Fang of Silverquill. He then taps 3 more to play another Morph. Then he goes to combat and swings 1 Morph, a 5/5 at me. I take the hit. Going down to 29, he then becomes a Monarch, and he goes to his instep, drawing as a Monarch. When Javonn decides to answer by tapping 1 and casting Path to Exile on my commander. My commander gets exiled, I put 8 counters on the Ozolith, and I go and find a basic mountain, put it into play tapped. Javonn starts off his turn by drawing his 2 cards, and then slowly decides which 5 lands he wants to tap. After which, he decides to cast his commander, Sliver Overlord, and passes. I untap for turn, draw my 2 cards, play Rootbound Crag, and then after fidgeting around with all of my lands for some reason because I can't math or decide which colors I need to use, I ultimately tap 5, and I cast my commander Hallar for the 2nd time. Before I can go to combat though, Robert taps 1 black, using Retribution of the Ancients to give him -3/-3, killing him. After which, I tap 5, and I cast a Kicked Wolfbriar Elemental for 1, getting 1 wolf token. I then pass my turn to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, we forgot about his Court of Ambition triggers, so we all either have to discard a card or take 3 damage. I choose to take the 3 as well as Robert, and Javonn discards a card. Justin draws 2 cards for turn, plays a Swamp, plays an Island, and then taps enough to cast a Court of Cunning, becoming the Monarch once again. He then draws a card as instep and passes to Robert. Robert untaps all his lands for turn, draws 2 cards, plays a Vault of Champions. He then swings Felisa in a Morph at me, but before damage is declared, he flips over 1 Morph, which is Bane the Living, for 7, giving all creatures -7, -7. In response to the Bane of the Living trigger, Javonn tutors up an Essence Sliver with the Overlord ability, and Robert gets 7 Inklings. At the beginning of his upkeep, Javonn puts a counter on his Aether Vial, draws his 2 cards, then decides which lands he wants to tap. Before tapping 4 and casting the Essence Sliver. He then taps his last 2 lands, and he casts a Sylvan Library before passing. At the beginning of my turn, I untap all of my permanents, draw my 2 cards for turn, play Mountain, tap my Soul Ring, and decide which lands I need to tap in order to recast my commander. Finally deciding on which 7 to tap in order to recast Hallar for the 3rd time. Go to combat with no answers. I move the counters over to him from the Ozolith and cast a kicked Breath of Dargaz, dealing enough damage to take out Javonn and Justin before passing. Robert untaps for turn, draws, plays a Plains, and then realizes there's no way he can stop me, and he concedes the game. Today's big winner is Fog-Raw playing Old Faithful Hallar the Firefletcher. He's able to amass enough +1/+1 counters and kick enough spells in order to take out his opponents and get the win. The MVP of today's game was Hallar the Firefletcher. Hallar was able to deal 21 damage off kick spells alone, along with an additional 18 commander damage, 11 to Justin and 7 to Javonn, making it 39 damage dealt overall by one commander. That's pretty good if you ask me. It's kind of crazy when you put a bunch of counters on him and you just swing with him because he has a built-in trample ability, which is great for dealing commander damage to your opponents. Thanks for watching, and be on the lookout for more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.